Welcome to session 3. This session is about April Twilights and Cather as a poet. And we're going to start with Mark Robeson, Union College, with a paper entitled Cather Anthologized, April Twilights and the New Poetry Movement. And let me tell you a bit about Mark, who many of you, I realize, already know. Mark Robeson is a retired professor of English and the former chair of humanities at Union College. He's a Cather scholar with numerous publications and presentations to his credit, particularly related to Cather's portrayals of the arts and recreation. So please welcome Mark Robeson.
Find the presentation here. Ooh, go. Rene Rapin, in his 1930 book-length assessment of Willa Cather's mid-career literary achievement, writes, quote, "There is very little of her verse and not much of any importance." Elizabeth Shepley Sargent echoes this dismissal in her 1953 memoir. Commenting on Knopf's 1923 edition of April Twilights and Other Poems, Sargent expressed regret that her friend Cather had, quote, reissued the early book at just the point when she had become a master of original prose. And today, Cather's reputation as a writer of both short and long fiction is so firmly established that her early 20th century standing as poet becomes a sidebar. And a glance at our schedule for this conference demonstrates this. Over 20 papers on her fiction, and a mere 3 discuss her poetry. Yet, measured by another standard, her inclusion in edited poetry collections, Cather can be seen as the real deal, a bona fide American poet whose work received significant notice. In addition to appearing in national periodicals in the opening decades of the last century, poems written by Willa Cather can be found in at least a dozen poetry anthologies dating from 1911 through the 1970s. While Cather relied on Badger's Gorham Press, a vanity enterprise, to print April Twilights in 1903, the subsequent notice of anthologists served to validate and to extend her reputation as poet. I approach Cather's poetry in this paper less from affinity toward Cather's verse than from a long-standing interest in how anthologies act as a marker of and an influence on canonicity. Perceptions of which poets are legitimate are shaped by who is in print. My earliest inkling of this process came from a copy of 101 Famous Poems that I could pull from the family bookcase and read. The little toy dog is covered with dust, but sturdy and staunch he stands. Little Boy Blue and his creator Eugene Field, with his oval photograph next to the poem title, are authenticated by their inclusion in an embossed leather volume alongside William Wordsworth and Walt Whitman. The concise Oxford Companion to English Literature defines canon as writings considered to represent the best standards of a given literary tradition. Chris Baldock, in the Concise Dictionary of Literary Terms, acknowledges the role anthologies play as cultural arbiters. The canon of a national literature is a body of writings, especially approved by critics or anthologists, and deemed suitable for academic study. Louis Untermeyer touches on this cultural work in the foreword to his 1962 edition of Modern American and British Poetry. This collection, he writes, aims to present a panorama in which the outstanding figures assume proper prominence, but in which lesser personalities are not lost. Which brings me to an underlying question. What is Willa Cather's proper prominence as an American poet? Untermeyer's answer to this question is to pretty much neglect her poems entirely, even in editions appearing decades earlier. Conrad Aiken, in his nominally comprehensive anthology published in 1929, also ignores Cather. Nevertheless, other prominent anthologists include Cather poems in their collections, an indication that they considered her verse an integral part of 20th century poetry. I began tracing Cather's inclusion in poetry anthologies with the help of two bibliographers. Bernice Sloat, in her 1968 Bison Books edition of April Twilights, provides a foundational publication history of Cather's poems, while Joan Crane extends this history in her 1982 work, Willa Cather, a bibliography. Sloat lists the publication of 7 distinct poems in 7 separate anthologies. Crane adds 2 further poems found in collections published in the 1970s. Having researched this paper, I can fill several gaps in the bibliographic record, now able to document 12 poems collected in a dozen different anthologies. One minor oversight involves the addition of a third Cather poem to a subsequent edition of the Home Book of Verse. And for those of you who have the handout, you can kind of follow along in the different listings here. In 1918, editor Burton Stevenson added the Cather poem A Likeness to a volume that in 1912 already included Grandmother, Think Not I Forget Thee, and L'Envoi. Also, Sloat and Crane missed Stevenson's separate 1925 collection entitled The Home Book of Modern Verse, which includes 4 Cather poems. A more substantial gap involves 3 poems which are not anthologized elsewhere, but are published in a significant 1927 anthology of American poetry, which I'll discuss later. Now, while the thought process by which each anthologist selected specific Cather poems for their collections is impossible to reconstruct, clues to their inclusion can be gleaned from editors' introductions. Some of these introductions reveal a circumscribed purpose. Anne Stafford's introduction to her 1972 collection, The Women Poets in English, viewed alongside her chronological arrangement of works dating from around the year 900 onward, suggests a project of text recovery and preservation. Similarly, in their 1934 anthology of ballads and folk songs, John and Alan Lomax aimed to preserve Spanish Johnny as musical Americana. Candida Lund's 1978 selection of Cather's The Poor Minstrel in The Days and Nights, Prayers for Today's Woman, seems motivated by the poem's overtly religious phrasing that harmonizes with Lund's desire to provide a new old way to pray. Contrast Sister Candida's specialized focus on prayer with the profligate scope of Wallace and Frances Rice, who write in their 1911 introduction to The Humbler Poets, a collection of newspaper and periodical verse, that their, quote, intention has been to include the work of men and women less well known, even to instances of poems produced by school children, by clergymen, lawyers, and physicians in the active practice of their profession, and by men in commercial business. The Rice's only exclusionary criteria are to draw a line against the works of persons well known in the United States and against rhymes which have not been able to endure the test of the market by commanding the attention of the press. Burton Stevenson's anthology, The Home Book of Verse, American and English, is the first in the list to place Cather's verse before a more general poetry reading audience. Stevenson intended his 1912 collection to bring together the best short poems in the English language from the time of Spenser to the present day, together with a body of verse which, if not great poetry, has at least the distinction of wide popularity. Now, whether or not he considered Cather's Grandmother, Think Not I Forget Thee, and L'Envoi great or merely popular, that's left unstated. However, when Stevenson brought out a new edition 6 years later, he added a third Cather poem titled A Likeness. In a separate 1920, um, let's see, lost my place here. In a separate 1925 anthology of modern verse, he also printed The Hawthorn Tree, The Palatine, and Spanish Johnny. Stevenson writes in his 1925 introduction that the poems finally selected have survived repeated readings and repeated winnowings. Cather's poem, Grandmother Think Not I Forget Thee, was anthologized in 1913 by Jessie B. Rittenhouse in the Little Book of Modern Verse, a selection from the work of contemporaneous American poets, which Rittenhouse calls a small, intimate collection representative rather than exhaustive. Her stated goal is to show what is being done by the successors of our earlier poets. The inclusion of fellow anthologists in the Index of Poets for Rittenhouse's Little Book of Modern Verse suggests a tight community. Present are poems from William Stanley Braithwaite, Bliss Carman, and Sarah Teasdale, three editors who anthologized Cather's verse, as well as one editor who did not, Louis Untermeyer. Elsewhere, in the Home Book of Modern Verse, Burton Stevenson cites his obligation to Mr. Braithwaite, Mr. Untermeyer, Miss Rittenhouse, Miss Monroe, Mrs. Wilkinson. This last listing led to my discovering Cather's inclusion in Marguerite Wilkinson's New Voices, an Introduction to Contemporary Poetry. Wilkinson's 1919 introduction to that volume devotes a full paragraph each to Jessie B. Rittenhouse, William Braithwaite, and Harriet Monroe, touting their achievements as anthologists. And Wilkinson includes poems by these three, as well as that of Cather anthologists Bliss Carman, Sarah Teasdale, and Monroe's co-anthologist Alice Corbin. My point here is that editors of poetry collections, who were poets themselves, often enjoyed reciprocal relationships with fellow anthologists. Willa Cather would have been known among these poets and editors as a literary gatekeeper herself. As managing editor at McClure's, her power to accept or reject submissions put her in conversation with anthologists. Cather wrote to William Stanley Braithwaite in May of 1911 to decline a poem by a Miss Eaton that Braithwaite had forwarded to her, explaining, "We are overstocked with verse that relates to a general sentiment rather than to a special experience." In the same letter, Cather also turned down an article Braithwaite proposed, softening the blow by reminding him, "We are fortunate in having a piece of verse by you in our June number." The next month, Cather once again turned down a Braithwaite query. "It seems to me that it might make an extremely interesting article, but McClure's never does anything at all in the way of literary criticism." Knowing that Braithwaite was working on an anthology of poems may have prompted Cather to be extra diplomatic in her refusals. In a letter dated March 7 of the year before, Cather offers a copy of April Twilights in exchange for a book of Braithwaite's poems, and enthuses, "Indeed, I should be very happy to have any verse of mine included in the anthology which your friend is making up." And by the way, if you're not with me on this, I think I decode my friend as just an indirect way of saying, "Yeah, I'd like to be in your anthology." When Braithwaite's anthology of verse for 1913 appeared, he not only printed Cather's poem titled A Likeness, but also categorized it as one of the best poems chosen from the distinctive list. In fact, he situated A Likeness at the head of his list of distinguished titles. And take note that her poem is listed above entries by Edwin Arlington Robinson, Joyce Kilmer, Bliss Carman, and Louis Untermeyer. Cather also corresponded with Sarah Teasdale, noticing a 1911 publication of Teasdale's, writing, "May I congratulate you upon your poem in the May Scribners? I thought it excellent." Later, praising the poet's new book. The longer poems at the beginning of the volume I truly do admire, but a good lyric with the real music of a song in it always seems to me worth more than any other kind of verse. Then, strategically, drawing attention to her own work, did you see some verse of mine in the September McClures, and did it remind you a little of Nebraska? Teasdale repaid these attentions by including two of Cather's poems in the Answering Voice, 100 Love Lyrics by Women. The year 1917 saw the publication not only of Teasdale's The Answering Voice, but also a collection edited by Harriet Monroe and Alice Corbin Henderson that they audaciously titled The New Poetry. A phrase no doubt rash, Monroe writes in her introduction to the volume. What did Willa Cather think about having her poems appear in the New Poetry? On the one hand, she complained to poet Edgar Lee Masters in 1920 that Harriet Monroe had botched the proofreading of Spanish Johnny, a complaint she reiterated by telephone 2 decades later to Alfred Knopf. A transcript of her call reads, "My dear Alfred, Spanish Johnny has several times been set to music and sung at various concerts, but I am glad to give permission to Mr. Sacco to use it again, provided he use the text as printed in April Twilights and not the text used in Miss Harriet Monroe's anthology. There are several bad typographical errors in Miss Monroe's book which make nonsense of the verses. For example, she prints for Moon Enchanted Plain, Moon Enchanted Lane. Of course, there are no lanes in southern Colorado, which is the scene of the verses, and such errors make nonsense of the little poem." On an earlier occasion, however, Cather seems pleased to have been included in the Monroe-Henderson anthology, writing to Blanche Knopf in 1923, "I'm sorry I cannot supply the material that bibliographer Merle DeVore Johnson wants for notes. The poems have been printed in a number of anthologies, but he probably wouldn't care to follow them up. Harriet Monroe's The New Poetry had rather the best selection." Monroe and Henderson's volume arrived during a decade when American poetry was undergoing significant shifts in form and style. Monroe founded Poetry, a magazine of verse, in October 1912, providing a forum that allowed poets and poetry to gain American exposure. A forum, by the way, that has been in continuous print since. Robert Frost published A Boy's Will in 1913, followed by North of Boston a year later. Carl Sandburg was making a name for himself with Chicago Poems in 1916, then Cornhuskers, for which he received the Pulitzer Prize in 1919. Early in the decade, Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle were instrumental in launching the Imagist movement. Amy Lowell took over from Pound to publish 3 editions of some Imagist poets between 1915 and 1917. Monroe and Henderson's 1917 collection, The New Poetry, includes poems by Frost, Sandburg, Doolittle, Pound, and Lowell, as well as by major 20th century voices T.S. Eliot, Edgar Lee Masters, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Edwin Arlington Robinson, Wallace Stevens, Sarah Teasdale, and William Carlos Williams. Among the works of this cohort, 2 of Cather's poems appear, and not bad company for Cather to keep. Harriet Monroe writes in the introduction to the collection, "The editors of this anthology wish to present in convenient form representative work of the poets who are today creating what is commonly called the new poetry. The difference between the new poetry and the old," Monroe explains, "is that the new poetry is less vague, less verbose, less eloquent than most poetry of the Victorian period. In presenting the concrete object or the concrete environment, whether these be beautiful or ugly, it seeks to give more precisely the emotion rising from them. The new poetry pursues an ideal of absolute simplicity and sincerity, an ideal which implies an individual, unstereotyped diction and an individual, unstereotyped rhythm." Monroe's description closely resembles Amy Lowell's Principles of Imagism, outlined in her preface to the 1915 edition of Some Imagist Poets, in which Lowell prescribes using the language of common speech, creating new rhythms as the expression of new moods, allowing absolute freedom in the choice of subject, presenting an image, and producing poetry that is hard and clear, never blurred nor indefinite. When Bliss Carman reprinted poems from April Twilights in his 1927 anthology, he wrote in his preface, "The most significant difference between the old poetry and the new, contrasting a doleful spirit of the old with the valiant and joyous spirit of the new." Among the anthologists who communicate this rejuvenation of American poetry and who incorporate Willa Cather in the mix, Bliss Carman's inclusion of 3 Cather poems in the Oxford Book of American Verse puts an exclamation point on Cather's place among early 20th century poets. Elizabeth Sergeant had it wrong to regret the timing of Cather's 1923 issue of April Twilights. And anthologists' notice of Cather's verse during the second and third decades of the 1900s makes it clear that she was being taken seriously as a poet, and that the moment was propitious for Cather to remind her readers that the novelist also wrote poems. Canonicity is fickle, however. Publication in one anthology does not guarantee inclusion in others, even as Cather's poetry garnered notice from Stevenson, Braithwaite, Rittenhouse, Teasdale, Wilkinson, Henderson and Monroe, and Carman. Her verse was ignored by Conrad Aiken, Alfred Kremborg, and Louis Untermeyer. When a revised version of the Oxford Book of American Verse appeared in 1950, this time edited by F.O. Mathiasen, Cather was cut, along with 146 other poets, in what Alan Golding calls the most radical redefinition of the canon ever. The Poetry Foundation, an online extension of Harriet Monroe's Poetry magazine, states, "For 21st century readers, the new poetry is a surprising, sometimes odd collection. You'll find Carl Sandburg, Willa Cather, D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, and early Kunitz and Cummings sandwiched between long-forgotten names. Of the names just listed, all are hyperlinked except Willa Cather's. And none of her poems is found on the Poetry Foundation website. Willa Cather pens what could be taken as epitaph for the ephemeral spotlight shown on many a poet published in a major anthology. In Rose Time, one of the poems that is incorporated in 1927's Oxford Book of American Verse ends this way: "For this is the joy of the rose, that it blows and goes."
Thank you, Mark, for that insightful paper. Our next presenter is Robert Thacker, who is, I should say, the current president of the Board of Governors of the Willa Cather Foundation. He's also a co-editor of the Willa Cather Review and professor emeritus of Canadian Studies in English at St. Lawrence University. Bob's latest book, Alice Munro's Late Style, Writing is the Final Thing, will be published by Bloomsbury Academic this year. And the title of his paper is The Making of April Twilights and Other Poems. Welcome, Bob.
I want to say before I say anything else that it's just great to be here on a panel talking about Cather's poetry. It's never happened to me before. Oh, do I have to talk into the microphone? Okay, yes, ma'am. How's that? Okay. Should I say what I just said again? Okay. I'd be happy to. All right. As I think will be evident, this is part of a longer paper, as everybody says. Oh, gee. What's that? Thank you. And thank you too, Melissa. Okay. Good. Good. Thanks, Mark. That was great. Thank you, Ashley. That was great. This is the paper. Cather's own copy of April Twilights is just upstairs in the archives. Here. In it, she kept tear sheets of poems she had published in periodicals subsequent to that book, that first book. She kept a dried wildflower there, and she made revisions toward April Twilights and other poems. Laid into it, too, is an anonymous review of the Heinemann British edition of that 1923 version of the book. The reviewer commented on the poems Cather retained from the book's first version, saying that they, and this is a quote, caused her to be hailed as the poetess that should come. And they are often tragical in intention, touched with the pessimism peculiar to young things, being in the shadows, so to speak, of their towering confidence in the future. This reviewer also comments that to go back 20 years to the verse one wrote in youth is to meet a stranger and envy his or her strange effervescence of anguished unreason. Finally, this reviewer quotes from two poems new to the revised book, Prairie Spring, which Cather first published in 1912 and in McClure's, and then used as one of the epigraphs in O Pioneers. And also The Gaul and the Capital, a meditation on the power that was Rome's. The end of a stanza asking, who could have hoped for the West, as this reviewer notes. He or she then mentions one of Cather's most anomalous poems, Street in Packingtown, where, and this is from Cather, a Pollock's brat joylessly torments a cat, before concluding of Cather, American-born, she has, at any rate, succeeded in Americanizing herself. That Cather saved this review and made it part of her own copy of her first book suggests something special in its assessment. The reviewer points to the driven poetic youth she was in 1903, and the reviewer acknowledges, through the quotation from The Gaul and the Capital, the connection to the classical that her poetry reveals. But most of all, the reviewer sees in the key later poem, Prairie Spring, the trajectory of Cather's Americanization. All of these elements were present and help explain the shaping of Cather the poet. In 1915, Cather expressed interest to her then editor, Ferris Greenslade at Houghton Mifflin, in an expurgated, and that's her word, an expurgated edition of April Twilights. But nothing came of that from Houghton Mifflin. The book Cather envisioned then did appear in the spring of 1923, as we know, from Alfred A. Knopf, as April Twilights and Other Poems. It was a very different book from its predecessor volume, one that resulted from the author's understandable rejection of attitudes she no longer held, of feelings she no longer felt. The 13 poems dropped from the first volume, The 13 poems dropped from the first volume owed to her 1902 trip to Europe, her enthusiasms then, or those poems which she judged to be weaker. But other expurgation involved her own conscious reshaping of her self-presentation, of her subjects, and most especially a reassertion of herself as a poet, while she was known then as an established fiction writer of real note. Her guise as a poet was not as well known, as has been said. And as her close scrutiny of contemporary poetry confirms, and Mark just talked some about that, and you certainly see it in the correspondence, Cather still saw herself as a poet. Poet Cather was, as April Twilights and other poems confirmed, just as she was about to learn that she had won the Pulitzer Prize for one of ours in May 1923, and just as her next novel, A Lost Lady, was being serialized in the Century. Cather and Knopf agreed to publish the book by mid-1922, for there is correspondence during the summer, and the contract was signed in November. In early July, Knopf writes to her proposing, and actually I just love this, so that's probably why I put it here. In early July of that year, Knopf writes to her proposing the idea of making your book of poems into a quite handsome deluxe edition. I have interested one of the finest printers I know in the idea, and they are very keen indeed to carry the thing through. He then continues to make a proposal that he knows Cather, the former magazine managing editor, might not accept. Now, Mrs. Knopf, now, the point is just this. The whole job and all its details would be left to the printers, to these printers. In a word, I get the manuscript and we both get finished books. Knopf believes he will like the result, but he knows Cather's decision is the key one. He continues, it isn't a matter of expense, of course, because making the books this way will cost me, I think, at least 3 times as much as making it in the usual way. But I know how particular you are, maybe peculiar too. Maybe peculiar too. I know how particular you are about manufacturing details, and he does not want to produce the book this way if it didn't please you. Cather did not accept Knopf's proposal. Not too long after, there's a letter to Knopf pulling 2 additional poems and substituting a third. And then another to Robert Josephy at Knopf, insisting that she see the foundry proofs of the book, which is obviously a technical request. What Knopf did do was to have this printer, Elmer Adler of the Pinson Printers, produce the limited deluxe first edition of 450 signed and numbered copies on February 20th, 1923, 2 months before the trade edition. This edition of April Twilights and Other Poems was the firm's first book design project, and that's from Crane, and it seems to me that that's significant. Cather took control of writing the advertising copy in the same vein, and that copy from the 1923 trade edition reads, Miss Cather's first published work was a volume of verse entitled April Twilights. The book has been off the market for some years, but has been greatly in demand by collectors, and a number of the poems have been consistently reprinted in anthologies of American verse. Mr. Knopf publishes Miss Cather's selections from the original volume, as well as her later verse, which has appeared from time to time in periodicals, together with a number of poems which have never before been published. This is still the copy. On reviewing Miss Cather's new novel, one of ours for the Atlantic, Mr. Gamaliel Bradford said, the sense of mystery and the sense of beauty makes the charm of this latest book of Miss Cather's as they made the charm of the lovely April Twilights years ago. And I like to turn back from Claude's heroic sacrifices to the verses which have sung so long in my memory. Written to emphasize the high quality of Cather's work, both the jacket copy and the Bradford quotation describes Cather the poet, and April Twilights and Other Poems aptly. and connect her most recent book with her first book, and implicitly with the poetic in her prose. And if you look at the reviews of the first reviews of one of ours, one of the things you see is that there are frequent mentions of Cather's poetry there. In 1933, okay, I've jumped a decade, which you need to do when you talk about this book. In 1933, when Knopf produced a fourth printing, the dust jacket copy reflected changes in the book, including a new poem, Poor Marty, which had not appeared in previous editions of this book, as well as mentioning more recent Cather fiction titles. It also quotes a strong 1923 review from the Boston Evening Transcript. One could quote indefinitely the sheer music and beauty of these poems. Every line in this slender volume bears the mark of a craftsman who will be satisfied with nothing less than perfection, and of the artist whose gift is very great. When April Twilights appeared from Richard G. Badger in 1903, and actually let me, because I've never had this chance before, I'm going to say something. We always say that Badger was a vanity press, and you just said that. The thing about that phrase is that at the time Cather was publishing in April Twilight, the first one in 1903, almost every press took money to produce small volumes of verse. And by almost every press, I mean ones that we would now think of as commercial presses. And Braithwaite, in his reminiscences, I mean, that's my source there, he goes press by press and says that. So now Badger made a business of it, but he also published plenty of poets who were very well known on their own. And in fact, the phrase vanity press really only became current after Cather had published that first book. So back to Badger. Okay. When April Twilights appeared from Richard G. Badger in 1903, it was treated as just what it was, a slim first book of poems showing aptitude and promise from a press known to produce scores of such books. For her part then, the high school teacher Cather was just another of Badger's Boston bards, and that's what they were referred to, although the reviews showed appreciation of her verse. The publication of April Twilights and Other Poems was an altogether different matter. Okay. Shaped by the then well-known author to produce just the version of herself as a poet she wanted to present, produced and appearing first in a deluxe signed limited edition from an emerging fine book printer, April Twilights and Other Poems was very much a part of the Cather Knopf publishing project that had begun in 1920. It helped confirm Cather as a major contemporary literary figure while reasserting her long-standing presence as a poet, just as poetry itself was largely taking altogether different forms. And I would point out that Eliot's The Wasteland appeared the year before the second version of April Twilights. Thus, like the first Cather Knopf volume, Youth and the Bright Medusa, which allowed Cather to represent herself as a story writer, revising and retaining 4 strong stories from the Troll Garden while adding 4 more recent ones, April Twilights and Other Poems represents Cather the poet in the same fashion, dropping 13 and adding another 12. Along with Spanish Johnny and Prairie Spring, 2 other added poems showing the shift west are The Swedish Mother and Macon Prairie, which focused on pioneering and the pioneering spirit, a subject that by then Cather had made her own and was continuing then with A Lost Lady. Macon Prairie eulogizes her aunt, Jenny Cather Ayres, a young widow and mother who, though in poor health, emigrated with her family to Nebraska in 1877 only to die shortly thereafter and to be buried here. Yet altogether differently, there is also among the poems first published in April Twilights and Other Poems, a silver cup which traces the existence of the talismanic title cup, beginning, quote, in Venice, under the Rialto Bridge one summer morning, in a mean shop, I bought a silver goblet. Cather narrates the story of this cup just as she narrates the stories offered in The Swedish Mother and Macon Prairie, having it first engraved, appreciating its history, probing the meaning of the words she found already engraved upon it. 4 words which mean that life is sweet together. Continuing the Silver Cup's journey, addressing it, she wrote that in some dark junk shop window I shall leave you, some place of poor effects from broken houses, where desperate women go to sell a saucepan, and frightened men go to buy a baby's cradle. Here in New York, a city full of exiles, short marriages and early deaths, and heartbreaks. There I shall leave you, a sole gracious object. Poems like these, narrative rather than lyric, in blank verse, show Cather changed as a poet, offering a story which marries the old world with the new here, and in April Twilights and Other Poems follows and complements Street in Packingtown. After A Silver Cup, there is another new and first published poem, Recognition, derived from her 1908 trip to Italy. 2 stanzas, imagistic with 4 rhyming lines out of 8. It feels the history of the old volcanic mountains that dream and dream 1,000 years and watch what is to be. Before adding the addition of Poor Marty as the last poem to the 1933 edition, Going Home, Burlington Route, first published there, ended April Twilights and Other Poems. In it, Cather returns west literally, for it begins, how smoothly the trains run beyond the Missouri. Even in my sleep, I know when I have crossed the river, the wheels turn as if they were glad to go. She repeats these 3 lines to begin the final stanza of the 3 stanzas in the poem, and continues to the final words of the poem and of the volume. It makes the final word of the volume home. They run like water, like youth running away. They spin bright along the bright rails, singing and humming, singing and humming. They run remembering, they run rejoicing, as if, too, they were going home. This poem and its book end with home as the last word, in a stanza that includes like youth running away, an image Cather would later make central to Lucy Gayheart, and also confirms the inherited lyric singing tradition of poetry she still valued. Just a few years later, Cather has Myra Henshaw assert in My Mortal Enemy, as she looks into the abyss of illness and death which confront her. How great the poets do shine on, Nellie, into the dark corners of the world. They have no night. This is just what Cather found in Shakespeare, and also in A.E. Housman, and Frost, too, and continued to find as a reader and sometime writer of verse. The elegiac feeling that flowered and that would later produce Poor Marty. It is possible, finally, to see the reshaping of one book, April Twilights, into quite another book, April Twilights and Other Poems, as a second instance of Cather's ongoing development for her purposes, as well as her response to shifting literary mores. She had already done this once, and here she did it again. I think in the interest of time, I'm simply going to stop there, because I go through some of the reviews that the book got, which I'd be happy to comment on if that's pertinent. But I want to go back finally to the anonymous review that she put in the April Twilights upstairs, because it seems to me that what that reviewer, whoever it was, got at was first what she was doing herself in the publication of April Twilights and other poems. And I think of that very much, I think of them very much as two entirely different books which reflect where she was at different points in her life. And also her own kind of looking back at the poet she was at a key moment in her life, which was obviously the first decade of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bob, for sharing one of my favorite Cather poems, which we didn't coordinate. I should mention too that Bob wrote the introduction for the April Twilights and Other Poems Pocket Edition. So if that isn't something that's part of your personal library, check it out downstairs in a not so shameless commerce plug. Yes. Our final panelist this afternoon is Becky Faber. Aside from Becky's extensive work as a creative writer, editor, and manuscript reader, she's a board member for the Nebraska Center for the Book and Nebraska Literary Heritage Association. She has published extensively on Cather, including in the Willa Cather Review and Teaching Cather. And her dissertation, All the World Seemed Touched with Gold, explored the George Cather family as a source material, for one of ours. I should add that Becky's a wonderful poet in her own right. Her paper today is titled 100 Years After April Twilights, Nebraska Poetry on the Page, 1923 to 2023. Welcome, Becky.
Thank you. My thought when considering the theme of the conference was to consider how poetry has developed, and some might say exploded, over the last 100 years since 1923's April Twilights. One critical source for exploring poets in the state is Dan Simon's book, Nebraska Poetry, a sesquicentennial anthology, 1867 through 2017. Beginning with Simon's book, we find a list of poets in the early 20th century that includes Hartley Burr Alexander, Willa Cather, John Neihardt, Lauren Isley, Tilly Olson, Carl Shapiro, Bernice Sloat, and Weldon Keys. So I want to begin by exploring ways in which some Nebraska poets write about this state. And I want to start with a poem from April Twilights, the one that Bob just mentioned, Cather's Going Home, Burlington Route, which provides a sense of place for Nebraska that is so often deemed flyover country. Going home, Burlington Route. How smoothly the trains run beyond the Missouri. Even in my sleep, I know when I have crossed the river. The wheels turn as if they were glad to go. The sharp curves and windings left behind, the roadway wide open, the crooked straight and the rough places plain. They run smoothly. They run softly, too. There is not noise enough to trouble the lightest sleeper, nor jolting to wake the weary-hearted. I open my window and let the air blow in. the air of morning that smells of grass and earth, earth, the grain giver. How smoothly the trains run beyond the Missouri. Even in my sleep, I know when I have crossed the river. The wheels turn as if they were glad to go. They like running water, like youth running away. They spin bright along the bright rails, singing and humming, singing and humming. They run remembering. They run rejoicing, as if they too were going home. Cather's description of coming home kindled my memory of what is probably the most well-known poem about the state, Ted Koozer's "So This is Nebraska." The gravel road rides with a slow gallop over the fields, the telephone line streaming behind, its billow of dust full of the sparks of red-winged blackbirds. On either side, those dear old ladies, the loosening barns, their little windows dulled by cataracts of hay and cobwebs, hide broken tractors under their skirts. So this is Nebraska. A Sunday afternoon, July, driving along with your hand out squeezing the air, a meadowlark waiting on every post. Behind a shelter belt of cedars, top deep in hollyhocks, pollen, and bees, a pickup kicks its fenders off and settles back to read the clouds. You feel like that. You feel like letting your tires go flat, like letting the mice build a nest in your muffler, like being no more than a truck in the weeds. Clucking with chickens or sticky with honey, or holding a skinny old man in your lap while he watches the road, waiting for someone to wave to. You feel like waving. You feel like stopping the car and dancing around on the road. You wave instead and leave your hand out, gliding lark-like over the wheat, over the houses. Those of us who live here have probably, at least once, had to explain to others why we live here, or what Nebraska is really like. This excerpt from Don Welch's poem, entitled Nebraska, reaffirms that happiness does exist within our borders. If Nebraska were the name of a Russian woman, they could love her. There would be a certain large-boned beauty about her, or she would be dressed in black and lace. Her waist would be small, and she would drag her long dress over a floor into a study lined with French books. She would be a pawn in huge novels of war. As it is, she is a woman of spare beauty. Turning away from him so that the fine hollows of her back were toward the bed, she said, "Why do you do this to me? Why do you keep imagining me in other places and states? And why do you keep assuming our children are unhappy?" You get it. Lenora Castillo, who grew up in a village in extreme western Nebraska, writes of the migrant workers who came to Nebraska during and soon after World War II, looking for a future to provide their children with the American dream. And here is an excerpt from her poem, La Nebraska. The promise of work brought my family north, crossing the never-ending Texas plain in a tarp-covered truck. My mother, feet swollen and pregnant, stood beside my father. 4 children pressed around her. In Colorado, long rows of barracks-like buildings welcomed us as we step off the truck. Questions of who can work quickly reduced our family to tally marks on a clipboard. 4 workers, 2 babies. Sleep eventually caught up with us as we inched our way through food lines, blanket lines. The first truck, bound for Montana, came and went, its quota filled, leaving behind disappointed faces and talk of the next one. The next one will be for us. 2 weeks went by. Another truck arrived. Single men, couples, and families, my family, boarded, filling a wish list from farmers in a state called Nebraska. Nebraska, 1950. We arrived on a small farm in the middle of nowhere. Here the air was clean and fresh, like the ice-cold well water that quenched our thirst. Scottsbluff Monument, a dark apparition rising from flat prairie, silently watched us through the cracks in our walls. Nebraska, a good place to work and raise children, my parents decide. But the others packed their belongings, afraid of snow and ice of winter, and tornadoes that fall out of the sky like thin black snakes from a torn gunny sack. If you've never been in the northern or western sections of Nebraska, you have yet to experience the variations in geography and dedication, and the dedication that it takes to live in the stark areas. This poem, I Spent the Night in Custer County, addresses these harsh areas. I spent the night in Custer County, driving through canyons, searching for a way out, a road that would lead to somewhere. But none exists. Only cattle grazing on hills as steep as life, on grass as sparse as hope, planted in soil as dry as my skull. Somewhere south of the South Loop lies Eden, where people dance in the rain, watch plants sprout, and practice fertility. But I'll spend another night in Custer County, counting rocks and dry gullies, cloudless skies, and yellow stars. In 1921, 2 years before the revised volume of April Twilights, Nebraska named an individual to represent the best poetry in the state. The first and only poet laureate was John Neihardt, who served from 1921 to 1973. He's probably best known for his 5-part Cycle of the West and Black Elk Speaks. Here are a few lines from The Death of Crazy Horse from the Song of the Indian Wars, published in 1925. I only wanted to be let alone. I did not want to fight. The gray fox sent his soldiers. We were poorer when they went. Our babies died, for many lodges burned, and it was cold. We hoped again and turned our faces westward. It was just the same out yonder on the rosebud. Gray Fox came. The dust his soldiers made was high and long. I fought him and I whipped him. Was it wrong to drive him back? That country was my own. I only wanted to be let alone. I did not want to see my people die. They say I murdered Longhair, and they lie. His soldiers came to kill us, and they died. After a 9-year gap from the end of Neihardt in 1973, in 1982 the state chose to designate a prominent poet to carry the title of state poet. And the support for this position comes from Humanities Nebraska, the Nebraska Arts Council, and the Nebraska Library Commission. Bill Clefcorn, a professor at Nebraska Wesleyan University in Lincoln, held that title from 1982 until 2011. During the years that Clefcorn served as state poet, Nebraska women writers came to the forefront. In 1984, Judith Sornberger edited a volume entitled All My Grandmothers Could Sing, Poems by Nebraska Women. Poets such as Lorraine Duggan, Shirley Bettner, Nancy McCleary, Laura Tohe, Hilda Roz, Elmaz Abinader, Nancy Westerfield, and Kathleen West were included in that book. The following year, 1985, Adjoining Rooms was published, a volume with poems by Elizabeth Bansett, Susan Strayer Deal, Linnea Johnson, Marjorie Sizer, and Judith Sornberger. In 2002, Times of Sorrow, Times of Grace, writing by women of the Great Plains and the High Plains, was a multi-genre collection. These 3 books redefined the place of women as writers in Nebraska. 2 additional publications of importance in the emergence of Nebraska poets were published during Clefcorn's tenure. In 2007, a collection of poetry entitled Nebraska Presence, an anthology of poetry, edited by Greg Kosmicki and Mary Kay Stillwell, was published. Was later chosen in 2018 as the One Book, One Nebraska for the statewide reading program. In 2011, Clefcorn's last year as state poet, the Midwest Quarterly published a special edition entitled 3 Generations of Nebraska Poets, including poems by Neil Harrison, Grace Bauer, Michael Catherwood, Barbara Schmitz, Roy Scheel, Dwight Marsh, Stephen Barrett, Lucy Adkins, Rick Marlatt, and Marilyn Dorr. Twyla Hansen of Lincoln followed Bill Clefcorn as Nebraska State Poet from 2013 to 2018. She holds a bachelor's degree in horticulture and a master's degree in agroecology. She brought an ecological influence to poetry, as shown through her poem, Sandhills Cranes. We watch them feed in fields near the river, stabbing at stubble with their dagger beaks, and overhead at dusk, flying back in loose drifts. Their guttural trills that can be heard for a mile, the slow flap wings, their ritual stilt dances, tall feathered bodies gathering and regathering. Cranes revered by cultures across the world, native peoples who imitated their moves, their hieroglyphs found in ancient temples. This raucous tribe that speaks of survival among the oldest species on the planet, success on sandbars in a narrow channel. Some 500,000 sandhills, named for the grass dunes that top an aquifer, potholes and lakes and wetlands on the Central Flyway. These living relics unchanged in their migration from Texas to Canada on a halfway stopover for millions of years on the diminishing Platte. Matt Mason of Omaha has served as Nebraska State Poet since 2019. He's led poetry workshops internationally in Botswana, Romania, Nepal, and Belarus. He won a pushcart prize and was granted a fellowship from the Academy of American Poets as a 2022 Poet Laureate Fellow. And I'm going to read just a brief excerpt from one of his poems entitled The Good News. Jesus lent me $10 when I forgot my wallet at lunch. Sure, he could have ordered a chicken pesto sandwich and broke it into 2 full meals, but he's no show-off. That's what I like about Jesus. Jesus listens to cool music. If it weren't for Jesus, I would never have known about Tom Waits or Annie DeFranco, and I sure wouldn't own any Lyle Lovett CDs. But Jesus makes a kick-ass mixtape. Jesus loves cows, thinks my poems with cows in them are a hoot, and encourages me to look at herds of white cows in a green field and imagine salvation is underneath each windmill. I wish you could hear Matt read it because he just slays it. As I'm moving here toward the end, I do want to point out that Nebraska has had a number of poetry periodicals. Prairie Schooner through UNL, Flat Valley Review through the University of Nebraska Kearney, and Plain Songs in Hastings College were the major 20th century poetry periodicals within the state. There have also been a number of presses in Nebraska, and this is probably most true and coincides with what Bob was saying about presses, probably from the mid-60s until maybe the late 80s. It was common to see Nebraska writers publish in Sandhills Press, Backwaters Press, Wayne State College Press, Bestseller Press, Windflower Press, and now the University of Nebraska Press is also working with a larger number of poets than before. We can't talk about Nebraska poetry without talking about the impact of Ted Kooser. He is the most well-known poet writing in Nebraska. He is part of what Dana Gioia described as the Midwest poetry renaissance of the 1960s and 1970s. His style has been described as drawn from common speech with subject matter common to the Midwest. He won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry in 2005 for his collection Delights and Shadows. He served 2 terms as America's Poet Laureate from 2004 to 2006. He initiated American Life in Poetry, a newspaper project to celebrate poetry. He was founding president of the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, and he has embraced other genres: children's books, nonfiction, memoir. In 2004, he published Local Wonders, Seasons in the Bohemian Alps, which was a few years later selected as a One Book, One Nebraska read. And he will be the first to tell you that writing children's books is one of the great joys of his life. So we come to that veritable question: what is the future of poetry in Nebraska? Well, we know that the virtual author series, coordinated here by the Cather Center, provides regular venues for writers with regional ties to share their works, processes, and backgrounds. Matt Mason's work with the Nebraska Writers Collective, based in Omaha, has developed workshops, programs, and poetry events. Stacy Waite of Lincoln has worked as a teaching artist with the Nebraska Writers Collective and its slam poetry program, Louder Than a Bomb, which allows high school students from around Nebraska to write, practice, perform, and compete in slam poetry events. In Lincoln, Karen Shoemaker has recently opened Lark Song Writers Place, which promotes a writing environment, readings, and programs. Throughout the state of Nebraska, there are frequent readings taking places at colleges, universities, libraries, and bookstores. The Nebraska Writers Guild and Nebraska Poetry Society offer classes, conferences, and opportunities for publication. Veterans organizations, such as Warrior Writers, meet in person and virtually to encourage writing opportunities. In 2008, Steve Langen, a poet in Omaha, initiated a 7 Doctors project, which encourages writing among healthcare professionals. Robert Brook from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln directs the Nebraska Writing Project that supports summer writing projects for teachers. And poetry continues to grow. In the interest of time, I've not been able to further explore other Nebraska poets such as Chuck Peake, John Brain, Larry Holland, J.D. Brummels, Charlene Neely, Dwayne Speaker, or Amy Pletner, but each of them has left a mark on the growth of poetry in our state. I think the future of poetry in Nebraska is very bright. Thank you.
Well, thank you again to Mark and Bob and Becky for those insightful papers. We, I believe, have some questions from our audience, and if you are pondering a question, raise your hand. We'll get to you shortly. All right, this question, the first one, looks like it's for Mark. Who or what poetic movement do you think influenced or inspired the poet Cather? Did she acknowledge such inspiration in writing?
Here's his answer. One of the things that struck me when I first started working, and I've been working on Cather the poet since like 2009, I mean, far too long. I viewed it biographically, and the thing is it seems to me that at that phase of her career, which essentially is some of the work was here, but it really begins when she first goes to Pittsburgh in 1896. Is that this was a person who was trying her hand at writing any form that was accepted. Okay, I mean, we think of her in those early years as writing a lot of stories, which certainly she did, but the journalism came before that. The poetry is part of that when she gets to the Home Monthly in particular, where she was an editor that she had to fill space and wrote poems, among other things, to do that. As far as a movement goes, I think that I found it useful to think about her as a late Victorian, and indeed somebody whom you mentioned, Mark, Bliss Carman. Because of my own background, I knew a fair amount about him, and he very much fits into the kinds of nature lyric that Cather found herself reading and writing, but the lyric most importantly. So I guess that's my answer. What's your answer?
Houseman,
Yeah.
A.E. Houseman. Well, I mean, her trip to Europe, one of the greatest disappointments of her life was when she went to meet, kind of cold knocked on his door, and he didn't live up to her image of him. But she just spoke very highly of A.E. Houseman's poetry.
I'm going to add another answer to him. I'd forgotten about Houseman. The thing that's interesting about that is that I mean, Cather picked up on a Shropshire lad almost as fast as anybody in this country did. She started speaking of him. She started writing about him. I don't think the visit was as bad as all that. But if you're interested in that, I think reading her letters about what the visit was and talking about it, and it's an amazing thing to me that just before she died, one of the last she was writing to Dorothy Canfield Fisher to resurrect memories of that visit. So here in 1947, she's thinking of it as an important thing, and I think that she was prescient in spotting him. And I think she was prescient in spotting Frost early on in the two books that Mark mentioned in his paper, his fine paper.
Well, again, we invite your questions, and as we wait for those, Becky, I think it was you mentioned this is perhaps a stretch, but 1921 that Nebraska names our first poet laureate. We of course know that Cather was following things that were happening back home in Nebraska. And Bob, I think you referenced that it was about 1922 that she signs the contract with Knopf to bring out April Twilights and other poems. So maybe this is a leap a little bit, but any indication that, what about that moment in her career would have motivated her to bring out this new edition? Any comments on that?
Yeah, as I said, it seems to me that it was a part of. Dr. Taylor in his comments today said that she was lucky. Okay, well, that may be, but it seems to me that this is an author who, in a lot of ways, from beginning to end, made her own luck. Okay, she was very ambitious. She knew everybody. She made contacts. And the reshaping of both Youth and the Bright Medusa and April Twilights was a part of that. That is, that she wanted to have that book of poetry out concurrent with what she was doing in the early 20s as a way of not selfishly asserting her project, but the thing is getting herself out there. Because the other thing I would point out in this context is that this is a writer who writes the essay. And the book of poems is early in 1923. Lost Lady starts appearing in Century. I think it's the beginning of the fall, but it's the middle of the year. And Nebraska, the end of the first cycle, is later in the year, in the fall, or I think maybe it was in November. But in any event, it's not coincidental that when you read that essay, it's an interesting advertisement for a lost lady. Okay, so by the way, I just published this book. Just as I did with these things downstairs. And that's what it seems to me that's although many people comment in histories of American magazines that Nation series on the States was a very important series as a kind of an arbiter of where the country was in the 1920s. And if you look at the list of the other people who did Sherwood Anderson, I've got a list someplace. I just read a list not too long ago. The thing is, these were all very prominent people who were household names to some degree as writers.
All right. Well, sort of gets back to what I touched on earlier with Neihardt. This question is, what did Cather know, if anything, of the work of John Neihardt? Did she follow it?
Well, she would have been certainly aware of Neihardt, and Neihardt had a very strong following in Lincoln. And so she would have, with her connections in Lincoln, would have been aware of the writing that he was doing, and this decision in 1921 to name a state poet laureate, which comes, decades after the state was established. And I'm not really sure why that was a point, but it seems to be garnishing around an American movement to embrace poetry in a stronger way. But yes, I don't know how well she knew Neihardt personally, but they would have had similar connections in Lincoln.
Also, he was in the anthologies. He's in the New Poetry and several other anthologies. So she's going to see his name in the books where she is also collected.
What do you have to say about the choice Cather made in removing poems from the first edition and adding poems? Do you agree with her choices?
Well, as I said, it seemed to me that she looked back at who she was in 1902, 1903, and I think that those poems, and actually, for those that are interested, it is salutary to look at her own copy of April Twilights. It's not extensively annotated, but there are plenty of annotations which suggest that she's thinking about shaping the subsequent book. I think that as that British reviewer said, that you when you undertake a project like this, you look back at who you were, in this case 20 years before, and reject some elements. And we haven't really touched on it, but it's a kind of a remarkable thing to me that she publishes April Twilights and Other Poems, and except for Poor Marty, that book is the last time she published poems. When she comes to be doing the Houghton Mifflin collected edition of her work, she dropped a couple more poems and moved things around. She also moved things around so that, I think, and by the way, this is not that interesting, but I'll tell you anyway. I think the reason that Poor Marty is in the last position in the 1933 edition of April Twilights and Other Poems is because, from a printing point of view, adding that poem was far simpler than reordering the poems. But Cather does reorder the poems in the collected edition, so that going home Burlington Route is the last one. So the last word is home.
I would also say that it seems a very natural thing for an editor to do, and she had extensive experience in editing. And anyone who writes and publishes, probably from day 2 after it comes out, goes back and looks and says, what was I thinking? Why didn't I include this? And just I think it's a very natural part of being a writer, is to go back and explore, what can I do that will make this stronger? And I suppose this is where I'm supposed to put in the plug that I also have a book of poetry downstairs in the bookstore.
Shameless. There's one other point too that hasn't really come up, although Mark alluded to it a little bit. When she got to McClure's, one of the things in the story that is usually put forward was that she got to McClure's in 1906, and almost right after that, whoosh, she goes to Boston to work on the Mary Baker Eddy project. Well, she doesn't go to Boston until January of 1907, and in that period in between, and you can see this in the correspondence, that she's a general editor handling all kinds of submissions and poetry, and I think what you quoted from Breakwith may have been from that period. The other thing she did was she pulled poems out of April Twilights, the 1903 version, right, and republished them in McClure's. Okay, and now when they appear in McClure's, they always say "from April Twilights" at the end. But just as your point was about the anthologies, she's paying attention to what people are doing, and she's making sure that she's out there in that way.
Well, I think this last question is a good one to end on, and I'd like all 3 of our panelists to address it. You get one Cather poem in the Ultimate American Poetry Anthology. This is a Cather poem. Which one do you choose? And I'll add that two of our panelists today already read from my favorite Cather poem, which is Going Home Burlington Route. So not that anyone cares what my answer is, but while they think.
Well, I would also select Going Home Burlington Route. And one of the reasons is that every time I read this poem, the line that strikes me is, even in my sleep, I know when I have crossed the river. Okay, I say this carefully. I was born and raised in Iowa. Every time I come back to Nebraska, I know when I have crossed the river. That line is so striking to me, and I suspect that that's true for everyone who's going back on that route to their point of origin. There's something, whether it's a stand of trees or crossing a bridge, I think it's just such a universal line that I find this to be the poem that I would put in there.
I think poem is poem. Well, I'd want to say the same thing on going home, but I'll leave it. Poor Marty is very strong in my imaginary. I like that poem a lot, and I like particularly the way in which when she published it, Blanche Knopf read it and wrote to her that you know, she prodded her and said, "I hope you're going to write that book of the South," or drawing on that. And she saw Blanche Knopf saw that in Poor Marty. So there's that. For Cather's career, I think if I were actually put to this question, I'd think about Prairie Spring, because Prairie Spring is and particularly when she wrote it, when she sent it in manuscript to Sargent, and then when she published it in McClure's and then used it as an epigraph for O Pioneers, is in a lot of ways kind of a synecdoche for what I would call her about face and turning west, which obviously, as we know, she was doing at that point.
Those are good poems, and I've got two answers, and I'm not sure which one I'm going to land on here, but I'll just describe them both and then make a choice. One that kind of comes back to me is Winter at Delphi, and it's kind of a haunting poem, and it, I think, resonates with a time when things, you know, the times seem in flux, and you're wanting direction from the gods, and where is the God? Let me just read one stanza. Cold are the stars of the night, wild is the tempest crying. Fast through the velvet dark, little white flakes are flying. Still is the house of song, but the fire on the hearth is burning, and the lamps are trimmed, and the cup is full for his day of returning. His watchers are fallen asleep. They wait but his call to follow, I to the ends of the earth. But Apollo, the god, Apollo, it's you know, waiting for something to a kind of divine instruction or something to come, and it's very plaintive. The other is Spanish Johnny, just because it has maybe the most legs, I guess, still. If you go on YouTube, you can find recordings of Emmylou Harris and Waylon Jennings singing Spanish Johnny. David Bromberg, I prefer his recording of it because he actually credits Willa Cather for having written it. But you know, that whole Lomax collection and the printing of the music there, that one, I think, you know, has had maybe a more lasting impact and a wider impact than any of the other poems.
Well, thank you again to our panelists this afternoon, Mark Robeson, Bob Thacker, and Becky Faber.